As Shane said, I am descended from the family. I was given Stoney as middle name, and my grandmother was a Stoney. But I have no Stoney relatives closer than third cousins. So what I have to say is based on almost entirely on written sources. The most important document for the family, which is the foundation of studies of the family, is some old annals of the Stoney family by Major Stoney, which I inherited a copy of. This was printed privately in 1879. And it has been updated by another member of the family more recently, Alex Stoney, who produced some newer annals of the Stoney family, and fortunately reproduces the old annals, but also has a lot of new material. And this is he published by the author in New South Wales in 2008. When I heard of it and couldn't find a library copy closer than Washington, DC, I wrote to the author, Alex, and he kindly had an extra copy printed off for me, which you can do with self-publishing sometimes. Anyway, the basic structure of the family is in Irish family records, formerly the landed gentry of Ireland. The Stoneys migrated to Ireland from the Yorkshire Dales, probably around 1693. George Stoney had been born in the village of Kettlewell and moved to the next village, Rilston, on marrying his wife Mary Moorhouse, who had land there. The land in Yorkshire was mortgaged for £800, and the Stoneys settled at Knockshagowna in County Tipperary. That's Knockshagowna in the distance. George and his wife were accompanied by at least two of their sons, Thomas, who was the eldest, and James. We know something about James, a grandson of James, John, who is on the tree as son of James, had a son called Captain Jack Stoney, who had a ship called the Saucy Jack, and he acted as a privateer during the American War of Independence. And with the profits of privateering, he bought a plantation in South Carolina. There are numerous descendants in America. One was W.E. Stoney, who was Assistant Adjutant General of the Confederate Army in the American Civil War. Another was Thomas Stoney, who built one of the first torpedo boats, the Confederate States ship David. Now, the family tree only records James as having the one son, John. It's unlikely that there was only one son, and even if John was an only son, it's unlikely that he had only the one son, Captain Jack. The problem is that there are a number of Stoneys in the Tipperary, Offaly area who can't really be placed on the family tree. They could be descendants of James. They could be descendants of George and Robert, who we know nothing about. They could even be descendants of John, who I have married in Yorkshire, ? Alex Stoney found a John Stoney back in Rilston in Yorkshire, who he thought was this John, and may very well have been. There is just one genealogical problem that I see, that George's grandson, George, this is the one on the bottom left-hand side of the family tree, he inherited at the age of 13 and therefore knew very little about his relations. And as a result of a chance meeting, he tried to establish contact. He found a contact with a distant cousin in Yorkshire who investigated for him. And the distant cousin does not seem to have said, actually, you have closer relations than me here. So there should have been closer descendants of John. Descendants of John certainly were in the Rilston area. So why wasn't that mentioned? So that's just a genealogical mystery. The number of descendants in Tipperary and Offaly by the time we get to the 19th century, they're not so many that they couldn't all be descendants of George Stoney, but a lot of them are Catholic labourers, and it seems quite possible that they are descended from an Irish family such as the O'Mulclougheys or Muckleys, who some of whom adopted the name Stone in English as a result of what people say is actually a mistranslation. Anyway, I'll come back to the eldest son, Thomas, who married Sarah Robinson. The Robinsons were Cromwellian settlers in the parish of Ballingarry, which includes Knockshagowna. This is Ballingarry in North Tipperary, not to be confused with the more famous Ballingarry in South Tipperary, known for the 1848 Rising. The Robinsons seem to have moved 3 times within the parish of Ballingarry, ending up in Knockshagowna, and I suspect that they took over the tenancy in Knockshagowna when Thomas Stoney moved to Greyfort, which is to the east of Borris-O'Kane, in the early 18th century. Both the Stoneys and Robinsons would have been tenants of the Sadleirs of Sopwell. Oops, that's, oh, sorry, Sopwell Hall. That's Sopwell Hall. I've accidentally missed out the Ferry Inn. These are some of one of the descendants who can't be found in the family tree is a John Stoney, who was a publican in very near Portland in 1829, and he was presumably proprietor of the Ferry Inn, which is still there. Another of the obscure Stoneys was a man called Thomas Stoney in Newport, County Tipperary, who was a shoemaker, and one of his sons played a great part in the establishment of the Methodist Church in Canada. Anyway, I'm going to say a word about land tenure. The Stoneys commonly took land for a 31-year lease, 31 years or 3 lives, possibly renewable forever. And then quite commonly, they actually bought out what was called buying out the head rent, which means that they acquired complete ownership at a later date when they, I suppose, when they could afford it. I'm making a point, oh yes, I was on Sarah Robinson. Sarah Robinson's mother was Mary Armstrong from Lusma in Offaly. The Armstrongs had been part of the plantation of Ulster, but some of them found their way south. I'm making a point of the families with whom the Stoneys intermarried, because sometimes you get the impression that Cromwell just dictated the geography or the land ownership for the next 200 years. But in fact, in this area, at any rate, a lot of soldiers who were allocated land quickly sold out to families who were already in Ireland and had accumulated a bit of capital. Anyway, to get back to the family tree, Thomas and Sarah had 3 sons, George, Thomas, and Andrew. Andrew married a woman, Jane Robbins or Jane Robinson. If she was Jane Robinson, she might have been a member of the same Robinson family, but there's not a great deal of information to allow one to establish that. Thomas married Mary Humphreys of Rushall in Leach. They had twin sons. Isaac became a rich lawyer in Dublin and eventually bought property and an estate at Frankford in Offaly, now known as Kilcormac. And this raises another genealogical mystery. Was it just an accident that Isaac chose Frankford? In 1770, he had married Anne Dunn from Frankford. That could be the explanation. But up to the previous year, the curate of Ballyboy, the parish which includes Frankford, was Reverend William Stoney. He was born in Kilkenny, and his father was called Isaac Stoney, who was an army officer. It looks very strange that Isaac Stoney buys land where the curate's father was another Isaac Stoney. We just don't know who this Isaac Stoney was, but I suspect he was a relation. He could have been another son of George Stoney, the original settler, because Mary Morehouse's wife was only about 38 when they came to Ireland. So it's possible that she had more children in Ireland whose details are entirely lost. The details of the children that we have come from the parish register in Rilston. And of course, there's no parish register in Ireland which tells us all about the family once they arrived. Anyway, Isaac Stoneys, this is the son of this is the two twin sons of Thomas were Isaac and George. Sorry, I'm just getting a little out of order. Yeah, Isaac Stoney, who settled in Portland in Frankfurt, had twin sons. Sorry, Thomas had twin sons, Isaac and George, and I'm dealing with Isaac first. Isaac's eldest son was another Thomas, who never married. In 1815, he was a tutor in English to a family in Louvain, now in Belgium. He was an amateur artist, and when he heard about the Battle of Waterloo, he rode over there and painted what I believe to be the first pictures of the battlefield of Waterloo. So obviously only a matter of days after the battle. He later became a grain merchant and died in Brussels. Alex Stoney, in his book, The Newer Annals, identifies this Thomas with the shoemaker in Newport, but he doesn't seem to be aware that he died in Brussels, and he also ignores the fact that he's not supposed to be, he's not supposed to have been married. So I think that means that Thomas of Newport is somebody that we don't really know where he fits in. Isaac Stoney's estate in Kilcormac seems to have gone to Thomas's brother Andrew. Andrew's son was Andrew Akers Stoney, who was Deputy Surgeon General of the British Army in the 19th century. He married Mary Frances Drought from Quigsborough in Offaly. The Droughts were a family who had settled in County Carlow around 1600. Andrew Akers Stoney's son, another Andrew, died in 1914, and the estate was auctioned. Their farmhouse is still there, though it's no longer used as a farmhouse. Another of Isaac Stoney's sons became a linen merchant in Tandragee, County Armagh, and had a mill nearby at Tullylish. Isaac Stoney's twin brother George Stoney became captain in the Royal Navy and was in engagements during the American War of Independence, fighting on the opposite side to his second cousin, Captain Jack Stoney. His daughter, Mary Margaret, married Sir Charles Morgan, whose house was called the grandest in Monmouthshire. Their son, Charles, became the first Lord Tredegar. I now come back to George Stoney, the eldest son of Thomas. And he was the ancestor of most of the other Stoneys and did much to build up the Stoney estates. It was probably him who acquired Ballymoney, later called Oakley Park, and Kyle Park and Arran Hill, which are to the west of Borrisokane. This drawing of Arran Hill was probably drawn in the 1870s, and it looks pretty ruinous, but possibly not absolutely ruined. It was badly damaged by the night of the Great Wind in 1839 and by a fire, and the Stoneys didn't use it as a main house after that. George also acquired Portland near Portumna in 1776 on a lease from the Earl of Antrim. The house seems to have been built by the Stoneys. George Stoney, who is acquiring this property, married Elizabeth Johnson of Emil Castle. The Johnsons were descended from one of the defenders of Derry in 1689, who had acquired property on the border between Offaly and Tipperary. Elizabeth's mother was Elizabeth Andrews of Rathenny. The Andrews family were granted Rathenny in 1667 after the Cromwellian period. It's interesting to see the letter which George's cousin John Scott sent him on his marriage. The last letter, dear cousin, the last letter I've been favoured from you, conveyed me one for our uncle, which met no delay in my hands, having been forwarded by the next post for Brussels after it arrived. This uncle is Andrew Robinson, who later became a Major General. There's a picture of him here. He would have been in Brussels fighting in the War of the Austrian Succession. And John Scott goes on, by a letter from my father, which came to me 2 days since, he gives me notice of your marriage. I have no reason to doubt from the good opinion I have conceived of your understanding, but that you have made a very prudent choice of a companion for life. Give me leave to offer you my sincere congratulations. It's the style of writing letters in those days. Now, we have here a map of the Stoney estates, Loch Derg on the left-hand side of the map to orient you. The black pointer is Knockshagowna, where they first settled. Then the blue pointers are where George Stoney had land by the time of his death. Greyfort and Killavalla to the east of Borrisokane, Aaron Hill and Kyle Park to the west of Borrisokane, Portland and Harvest Lodge up near Portumna, and near Clarine we have Ballymoney, and there are also 3 estates which don't have houses on them. Gortland Row on the outskirts of Neenah, and off the map some land near Tarbert in County Kerry, which I'll come back to, and land in Doros, County Galway, which seems to have been used for timber. Also, the red pointers are the lands of Johnsons, George Stoney's wife, Emil Castle and Ballynocane, which were bequeathed to George Stoney's second son, Thomas Stoney, who I'll be coming to. Finally, up here, the purple pointer is Frankfort or Kilcormac, where Isaac Stoney established his property. Now, Major Stoney writes this about George Stoney. He carried on extensive farming operations, including the culture of hops and tobacco, and didn't know tobacco could be grown in Ireland, but apparently it was. Sometimes employed so many as 70 men a day to thresh his corn. He dealt largely too in sheep and black cattle. In 1 year, his fleeces numbered 2,633, and he sometimes sent as many as 130 bullocks to a fair. And yet his own affairs did not monopolize the whole of his business capacity. He acted as agent to his relatives, Generals Armstrong and Robinson, and others. General Robinson is the Andrew Robinson that we've just been talking about. General Armstrong is General Bigo Armstrong. The Bigos were Huguenot glassmakers living in Burr and Luspa, and Bigo came to be used as a Christian name in the Stoney family, although the Bigos were not actually ancestors of the Stoneys. General Bigo Armstrong was the second cousin who had an estate at Barnagrotty in County Offaly. As Major Stoney says, he added year by year to his patrimony. He gave handsome fortunes to his 6 daughters. In fact, it was £1,000 to each of his 6 daughters, which would be something like 80,000 in modern values. As an example of his hard work, here are some entries from his diary for in April 1765. We have George Stoney's diaries for 2 years, just 2 years, but they contain some interesting information. On the 24th of April, 1765, received a letter to let me know Clement Sadlier and Mr. Smith were at, there's something unreadable, set out for Holy Cross to meet them. Drank a bottle of wine last night and am not well today. High wind and wet. Roscrea, Clinikenny, Killisesk in 7 hours ride, near 28 miles Irish. Next day at Holy Cross, met Messrs. Tom and John Smith, Mr. Thomas Bunbury, Clement Sadlier, consulted about a match between Miss Sadlier and Mr. John Smith, whose fortune by his own account was £750, seems off on account of settlements. Settlements meaning that charges on the land, probably to female relatives. Anyway, on the next day, rose at 5, set off to Boris Fair, and wrote home at about 9 at night. So that's an example of hard work. Some of his land was let to tenants, and as a magistrate, he could get away with a lot here. February the 10th, 1766, in the evening searched William Meehan's cabin and found about 2 barrels of my beer, which his wife confessed to have been stolen out of my barn. Brought it back, took up his 2 cows and a calf. So we don't know what happened to the Meehan family. His family were not all as fond of hard work as he was. To quote from his diary in 1781, when he's in his late 60s and becoming a bit crusty, on the 25th of February, Ruth, daughter-in-law, Kitty, Fanny, Ralph, Willie and Tom all to Modrini Church to see Mr. Pretty's cavalry parade. Mr. Pretty would be the family that produced Lord Dunalley, another landowner in the area. A fine life while it lasts. Eating, drinking, sleeping and merriment would seem to be the use we came into this world for. The morning spent in preparation for the entertainment of the day, which is ended with a very little or very few thanks to the bountiful donor. And again on the 4th of April, family all abed 10 o'clock. He's talking about 10 o'clock in the morning, of course. Single self at his bread and whey. Servants complain of want of rest. Obliged to keep late hours waiting for their mistress, they cannot rise to attend the morning work. Ladies down to breakfast at 12. And another one here. 17th, Armstrong, this is one of his sons, no sooner returned from Nina assembly, but off he rides to Burr meeting. Such doings cannot hold long. Bankruptcies must ensue. Deprived of every prudent measure, our young ones are hurrying on to their own destruction. And sorry I am to observe the mother, who at her time of life should have sense to consider consequences, but will not, gives all her aid and encouragement to her children in their excesses. Unhappy for them, they will suffer for it when they feel poverty, which through unavoidable circumstances must come. Young people are easily caught in the snares of pleasure, but to see the hoary head, this is his wife, that should instruct, lead or advise, to tread in the fashions of this world, that broad path which leads to destruction, is a melancholy reflection. Inclination that prompts to pleasure is so strong that a father's advice has no weight, where the mother joins in the cry, take your pleasure while you can. And again in the 14th, yes, 14th of August, Tom, there's his son and wife on evening visit, left them at supper and went to bed. My family are too genteel to attend to my rule of lying down or rising in the morning. They despise Solomon's description of the sluggard. But should poverty creep in at the door of sloth and dissipation, as it always must, then fatal experience will convince his words are true. The youngest child in the house will not be put to bed when I go. No, his tender mother replies, will you not let him have his supper? An excuse every night to indulge the child after I am gone, to his manifest prejudice. But for peace sake, I must submit. Anyway, so George believed in looking after the pennies in everything except hospitality, where his table was always well attended. Something of his political views. With the volunteer movement in 1779, he had become colonel of the Boris O'Kane Volunteers, who also included his son Thomas as a major and an Anthony Stoney as a lieutenant. Anthony is another relative that we can't place on the family tree. In a letter in 1784, he wrote, I fatally foresaw and told many what would ensue on the dismissal of the Great Pitt and rejection of the American petitions. He is referring here to the fall of the replacement of Pitt by the Tory government under Lord North, which imposed the stamp duty on America and partly at any rate provoked the American War of Independence. So his politics are very much Whig. And in another letter in 1784, he wrote, this is slightly afterwards, "Here I have dreadful apprehensions from opposition against a reform in our parliament and protection duties, which may bring on dreadful consequences, such as we have seen in America. Offended volunteers may sullenly lie by. Bigoted papists," this is just a term for Roman Catholics, "may hope to become uppermost by our anarchy. France, now so powerful at sea, may at will land men at arms." This is France before the French Revolution, of course. "Multitudes of papists, encouraged by their priests, would fly to the standards of France, who no doubt would publish manifestos full of the most flattering promises that might be thought favorably of by a disgusted people, whose rights are trampled on and withheld by a set of venal boroughmongers." That's people who sold seats in Parliament. As an example of his outlook, here, this is another letter which refers to his youngest son, George. "I hear a great character of Mr. Sellers' Academy at Chester. My son George is a promising boy, near 13 years of age, writes well, reading Virgil and Greek grammar. He has been at a good school in Banagher, but the mistaken indulgence of too tender a mother would be his ruin if left near home. This is my motive. Besides, he may get rid of our Irish brogue, by which I take it that he thought that a more English accent would help him in his career." I now come to the children of George Stoney, and I show the family tree. George's eldest son was Andrew Robinson, who was certainly the most notorious member of the family. He could be called an adventurer. This is, we have Andrew here. It is said that Thackeray's character Barry Lyndon is based on him. There are certainly resemblances in character, though the life stories are different. His first wife was Hannah Newton of County Durham, who had 20 or 30,000 pounds from coal on her family's land. As she could not be expected to marry a landless man, his father made over to him, that's Andrew, some of his land. He treated his wife abominably, at one stage locking her in a cupboard for 3 days. When she died of consumption, he set his sights higher still. The Dowager Countess of Strathmore, who was said to be the greatest heiress in England, if not in Europe, with a fortune variously stated as £600,000 for £1 million, the money again coming from coal. He arranged for a fake fortune teller, who obviously told her who she should marry, and persuaded a friend who was editor of a newspaper to publish anonymous scurrilous attacks on her, and then challenged the editor to a duel, which is said to have been a fake. She believed that he was mortally wounded and agreed to marry him, but she wasn't a complete fool. Before the marriage, she transferred a lot of her property into the hands of trustees so that he couldn't get his hands on it. And after the marriage, he forced her to cancel the transfer. He used her influence to become MP for Newcastle. After the marriage, she treated her so badly that she sued for a judicial separation from him, something which was a very rare occurrence in those days, and was eventually granted it. She managed to get the estate back. The story is told in a biography by Wendy Moore called Wedlock, How Georgian Britain's Worst Husband Met His Match. George Stoney's second son was Thomas, and the bulk of the estates went to him, but I'll talk about the other children first. The third son was James Johnson Stoney, and Major Stoney has an anecdote about him. It is told of James Johnson Stoney that when quite a boy, he was sent by his father to Ballymoney to look after the steward, who was suspected of dishonesty. At the time, the old castle there was used as a dwelling, but was supposed to be haunted by the ghost of a medieval chieftain. In the middle of the night, James was awoke by the clanking of someone in armour coming up the winding stairs to his bedroom. But nothing daunted, he lighted a lamp, seized a pistol, and confronted the ghost, who fled to the steward's room, closely pursued by James, who there discovered it was none other than the steward himself, encased in a sheet and encircled with plough chains. James's father was so pleased with his brave conduct that he promised to leave him Ballymoney, which he did. Ballymoney was later called Oakley Park. James was married twice. Catherine Baker was one of the Bakers of Lismacue, who were of English origin and arrived in Ireland in the early 17th century. His second wife was Letitia Going, one of the Goings of Cranagh, which is between Neenah and Bird Hill. The Going family are said to have come from Cavan and to have been originally Gowans. The Ballymoney estate was eventually mortgaged and passed over to James Johnson Stoney's eldest son, George. It came before the Encumbered Estates Court in 1850 and was bought by the only bidder, James Johnson's widow, Letitia, who bought it for £400. Obviously, nobody else was willing to take it. She passed it on, but it eventually passed out of the family. George, this is James Johnson's son, George. In a letter to Freeman's Journal in 1833, he remarked, "Traveling last summer over 3,000 miles of the United States of America, I have found the slaves infinitely better fed, clothed, and housed than the generality of the poor of our own poor land." Whether that's accurate or not, I don't know, but it shows his opinions. George married Anne Blood of Cranagh, County Clare. The Bloods had settled in County Clare in the early 17th century. One of them was Colonel Thomas Blood, who is famous for attempting to steal the crown jewels from the Tower of London. The three children of George and Anne are noteworthy. One of them is probably the most famous Stoney of them all, George Johnson Stoney. He spent many years as secretary to the Queen's University of Ireland. His most famous achievement as a scientist was to propose the existence of the electron. He is remembered in Stony Road, Dundrum, on which he lived. His wife died while his children were small, and he brought them up himself, which was unusual for those days. His son Gerald Stoney was a pioneer of steam turbine engines, and his daughter Edith, Gerald's sisters Edith and Florence both received a university education. Edith was a physicist, and Florence was the first female radiologist in Britain. George Johnson Stoney was also the great-grandfather of Alex Stoney, who wrote the book, The Newer Annals. George Stoney's brother, Bindon Blood Stoney, became chief engineer of Dublin Port. He was responsible for a lot of the development of the Dublin Quays and for the Alexandra Basin, for a new method of designing bridges, and for the diving bell, which allowed excavation of the riverbed so that concrete could be laid. Apparently working conditions in it were quite appalling. Bindon Blood Stoney is remembered in Stony Road, North Strand, and the recently opened Blood Stoney Road in the Docklands. The sister of George Johnson and Bindon Blood, Anne Frances Stoney, married Dr. Fitzgerald, Bishop of Cork and later Bishop of Killaloe. One of their children was George Francis Fitzgerald, a physicist who is remembered for the Lorentz Fitzgerald contraction, which is part of Einstein's special theory of relativity. Another son of James Johnson Stoney was Robert Johnson Stoney, a land agent and actuary, who was clerk to the Parsonstown Board of Guardians. In a book by Kieran Riley, he says, as a means of coping with the destitution in the workhouse and to relieve individual estates, agents such as Stoney, meaning Robert Johnson Stoney, used their power as guardians to oversee the emigration of a large number of young women from Kings County, the majority of whom were sent to Sydney, Australia in 1849 and 1850. Robert married Anne Smithick. There was a Smithick family near Neenah, but I haven't been able to place Anne. Their children included my great-grandfather, the Reverend George Robert Stoney, and Canon Robert Baker Stoney, who was rector of Killiney for many years. James Johnson Stoney's only son by his second marriage was Dr. James Johnson Stoney, medical officer on the Aran Islands. A grandson of his was George C. Stoney, a renowned documentary filmmaker in the United States. One of the daughters of James Johnson Stoney was the mother of Margaret Anna Cusack. who adopted the name and religion of Sister Mary Frances Clare. She joined an Anglican religious order. Later she became a Catholic and joined the Poor Clares. For her work to relieve poverty in Kenmare, she was called the Nun of Kenmare. She founded a new Catholic order, the Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace, but she was apt to quarrel with bishops and eventually returned to the Anglican Church. Now, after James Johnson Stoney, we have Bigo Armstrong and George Robert. Major Bigo, they were both army officers. Bigo Armstrong Stoney became a major, and as well as Killaballa House north of Greyfort, he owned the Rathmore Mills in Borris O'Kane. He inherited the land near Tarbert. This is the land where they're now wanting to build a gas terminal. There doesn't seem to have been a substantial house there, but he could receive the rent as an army officer, wasn't expected to live on his salary. He married Mary Julian from nearby in Kerry. This estate, the Killaballa estate, was in financial difficulties, and two of Bigo's grandsons, probably the only ones to reach adulthood, emigrated to America. I now come to the 6 daughters of George Stoney. 2 married Smith brothers, William Smith of Gurteen and Ralph Smith of Lismacrory and Milford, both in the parish of Ballingarry. Ralph had just built a new house at Milford. Another of them married Bladen Swinney, a linen draper of Dame Street, Dublin. From the address, we can assume he was pretty prosperous. The other 3 married into the gentry of Laois. I now come to the second son of George Stoney, Thomas, who inherited most of the land. He married Ruth Faulkner of County of Mount Falcon, and Aaron Hill was settled on him at that time. It's interesting to hear how these things were negotiated. This is George Stoney writing to Thomas's intended father-in-law. My regards to you and family render it very distressing to me that I cannot alter my sentiments with regard to the treaty lately on foot between us, nor can I hope any blame be laid at my door, as on consulting my best friends, I am informed I have offered more than an equivalent for the fortune intended Miss Faulkner, whose good sense and happy disposition are of the greatest weight with me. But then you know, my dear sir, that I have a numerous family to provide for, and what I give my son will be a great bar to getting off my daughters and discharging my debts. Therefore, if I act as a just father, I cannot nor will not do more than I at once proposed. And when you consider my situation, you cannot say I do not give my son a full proportion of my fortune. Had I a certainty of long life, I might risk more, but that cannot be in this world. He must therefore be content with what I can give without great prejudice to my growing young ones, or remain as he is for some years. The letter apparently worked because they did get married. Thomas, as I've said, was bequeathed the lands of the Johnson family, Emil Castle and Ballynocane. We had Ballynocane, there's Ballynocane. And I left out this letter which Ruth sent to her husband Thomas. Do not forget my shawl, but no scarlet in it, gloves or ribbons for nurse tenders, cottons for stockings for your honour, and muslin for stocks. They say the best tea and best salmon in Ireland are got in Clonmel, but this as you like. Remember me affectionately to Colonel Bagwell and family. I hope to live to get votes for him yet. So women could canvass even if they couldn't vote. Colonel Bagwell, the Bagwell's father and son were MPs for County Tipperary, both in the Irish Parliament and later in the Westminster Parliament, and were generally followed what would be called the Patriot Party in Ireland, or Whig Party as it would be when they got to England. We can guess that Tom inherited his father's political views. In 1798, he was offered a baronetcy if he would support the government and turned it down. Nevertheless, he had duties. He was a deputy governor of County Tipperary, and at the end of so this is what Major Stoney comments. At a very critical period, he guaranteed the king's pardon to many of the peasantry who might otherwise have suffered death as the rebels. In the Great Rebellion of 1798, he did not quit his post, but he barricaded Arran Hill against night attacks and kept the neighbourhood in order with his yeomanry. Then, when the insurrection was put down, there was no magistrate in the country to whom the rebels asked in greater number to deliver up their arms, nor on whom they depended more for pardon. It was not an uncommon sight of a morning to see 100 pikes stacked before Arran Hill half door. The handles were broken or burned, but what the cautious magistrate did with all the pike heads is a secret to this day. Some say, however, they were deposited by night in sundry deep bog holes. The implication here is that the people who surrendered their pikes were confident that nothing more would be heard of the matter. One of Thomas Stoney's grandsons, Thomas Butler Stoney, left this reminiscence. I recollect being at Arran Hill in 1823. The custom of the house was to have a large dinner party every Sunday. From 20 to 30 people usually dined there. In fact, every member of the family, as well as every intimate friend in the neighbourhood, had a carte blanche. Every gentleman posting through Boris O'Kane, which had only a modest inn, was welcome at Arran Hill, where all guests were treated with great hospitality and kindness as long as they wished to stay. Mr. Stoney, being the principal magistrate in the neighbourhoods, usually held a petty sessions court on his hall door steps and administered justice from a large armchair in the porch. Thomas and his wife Ruth had 17 children in 18 years. In his will, Thomas also recognised 3 natural children, Eliza, Bigo, and George, who were born after his wife's death. And she doesn't seem to have died of childbirth, by the way. Each of them was given a small income to be claimed from their half-brothers. In fact, there seemed to be 4 natural children, as in one of the rare survivals of the 1821 census, we find Mary Stoney, aged 7, and George Stoney, aged 5, living as lodgers in the house of a 65-year-old widow, Sarah White, in the townland of Breakmore. Breakmore is the next townland to Oakley Park, where Thomas's brother, James Johnson Stoney, lived. So obviously an eye was being kept on them. Presumably Mary died by the time of the will. In his will, Thomas requests that the surviving 3 continued to be looked after at Emil Castle, showing that they were now living in one of the family homes. The boys were to be established in some business, and Eliza to attend school for a year or 2. Bigo became a policeman. He doesn't seem to have married. George also became a policeman and later ran a shop and hotel in Temple Moor, County Tipperary. The hotel was passed on to his widow and daughters, one of whom was still running the hotel when she died in 1918. A son of George's emigrated to Nova Scotia and his descendants in the United States. Eliza was transported to Australia for larceny in 1841. Her son, who also had the name Bigo Armstrong Stoney, got to Australia, some say, as a stowaway. He married twice in Australia, the first time giving his parents as Tom Stoney and Eliza Stoney cousins, the second time naming his father as Thomas Johnson Stoney. Alex Stoney in his book identifies this man as Thomas Johnston Stoney, not mentioning that this would have been Eliza's half-brother. While such things are possible, I think it is more likely that Eliza is the Eliza Stoney who married a Tom Stoney of Boris O'Kane in Terry Glass in 1828. Tom Stoney of Boris O'Kane doesn't fit any known member of the family, so he's another one of the people missing from the family tree. Whatever happened to this Tom, it's unlikely that Bigo Armstrong Stoney knew much about him and may have picked up the middle name Johnson through some confusion. The marriage in 1828 was performed by Eliza's half-brother, the Reverend Ralph Stoney, from whom she was due a small income. So this seems to fit quite well. I now come to Thomas's 17 children by his wife, 13 of whom survived infancy. I'll deal first with his daughter Ruth, who married her third cousin Robert Robinson, who bought the estate of Ballyneven and Clough-Keating, which is just beside the Stoney estates of Greyfort and Arran Hill. The Rogers family who owned this estate had got into financial trouble, and there was now a court arrangement which involved a sort of consortium which included the rich lawyer Isaac Stoney. And Ruth, that's Ruth Faulkner's great-grandmother, had been Maria Rogers, so there was a family connection already. The Rogers family were Bristol merchants who settled in Cork before they acquired Ballyneven. One of the granddaughters of Robert and Ruth was my great-grandmother, Grace Robinson, so I have a Stoney ancestry twice over. My great-grandparents were second cousins once removed. Of Ruth's sisters, Mary Ann married the Reverend John Travers, rector of Kinnitty, County Offaly. Elizabeth married Samuel Barry, a Dublin attorney. Frances married her cousin Robert Stoney, son of Major Vigo Armstrong Stoney. Two of their brothers died fighting with the army, Robinson in the West Indies, Andrew in India, and another brother, Robert, also died in India. This left 5 sons of Thomas Stoney looking for inheritance, and his estates were divided between them. This is George, Richard Faulkner, Thomas Johnson, Reverend Ralph, and James. Another James Johnson Stoney, not to be confused with the previous one. The eldest one, George, married a cousin, Mary Ann Smith. He died before his father, and his son, Thomas George, inherited Kyle Park and Arran Hill. He married Anna Henrietta Waller, one of the Wallers of Finnoo, who were Cromwellian settlers. Thomas George gave so much employment during the famine that the estate got into financial difficulties. He is buried in Burr, and his wife is buried in Finnoo with her relatives at her own request. This is said to be due to an affair that he had with a servant girl, and there are said to be Australian descendants of this relationship. A son of Thomas George was Francis Gould Maroney Stoney, an engineer who invented a new device for sluices used on the Manchester Ship Canal and elsewhere. Another son was Edward Waller Stoney, who became chief engineer of the Madras and Southern Maratha Railway in India, and is remembered for bridges and for inventing a silent punker wheel, which is a sort of fan. His grandson was Alan Turing, who could be called the inventor of the computer and worked at Bletchley Park during the war, recently portrayed in the film The Imitation Game. The next surviving son of Thomas Stoney was Richard Faulkner Stoney. He inherited Portland and also Gorton Row on the outskirts of Neenah, where the Stoney name is commemorated in Stoney Heights. Richard married Jane Butler of Castle Crine in County Clare. These Butlers are descended from a mayor of Limerick and are believed to be related to Lord Dunboyne. The descendants of this couple called themselves Butler Stoney. Their eldest son was Thomas Butler Stoney, who in 1865 he obtained a confirmation of the Stoney coat of arms. At the time of the famine, he offered his cottier tenants money to emigrate to America. His grandson, Major Charles Kemble Butler Stoney, was the last to live at Portland. According to a newspaper report in 1938, Portland Park House, about 3 miles from Portumna, the property of Major C.K. Butler Stoney, was destroyed by fire in the early hours of this morning by armed men. Major Butler Stoney has not lived there for the past 10 years, and the house had been given by him to the trustees of Emmanuel Home Rathgar as a home for Protestant children. It is understood that there was some bad feeling over the matter in the district, but an assurance had been given that it would not be a proselytizing institution, that only Protestant children would be sent to the home. There was no question of land trouble since the lands had been divided some time ago. It's clear from the various reports that the arsonists did not believe the assurances about no proselytization. This is what Portland looked like in 2013. Thomas Butler Stoney's brother James married Mary Frances Elwood, heiress to an estate at Knockadoo, County Roscommon. His eldest son, Robert Easy Stoney, made money in India and bought Rossturp Castle in County Mayo. The younger son of James, Captain Thomas Butler Stoney, bought Oakfield Park in Raphoe, County Donegal, but his son Cecil was a noted ornithologist. This seems to have been the only branch of the Stoneys to prosper after the famine. I now come back to the sons of Thomas Stoney. After George and Richard Faulkner, the next one to inherit was Thomas Johnson Stoney, who I mentioned before when discussing Eliza Stoney. His wife, Eliza, was yet another member of the Going family of Cranagh. The estate was dealt with by the Court for Relief of Insolvent Debtors in 1848. The next son of Thomas Stoney was the Reverend Ralph Stoney, rector of Terry Glass from 1810 to 1856. He inherited Ballynocane and Ballycapel and married Abigail Sadleir, a distant relative of the Sadleirs who lived in Sopwell. Several of their children are interesting. One of them was Frank Sadleir Stoney, the Major Stoney who wrote the book. He retired as Lieutenant Colonel, Assistant Superintendent of the Royal Gun Factories in Woolwich. He also wrote a textbook on gun manufacture and a biography of his ancestor, Sir Ralph Sadleir, Secretary of State to Elizabeth I. The fact that we have such good knowledge of the Stoney family tree is undoubtedly due to him, and in most respects he can't be faulted. But there is one point that has to be mentioned. He reports that his sister Abigail died on the 21st of November 1874. She did indeed, but not as Abigail Stoney. She died as Abigail or Abby Shanahan. She had married John Shanahan on the 19th of October 1848 in Cloughjordan Catholic Church and at Nina Registry Office 8 miles away on the same day. This was possibly because there was legal doubt as to the validity of the marriage of a Protestant conducted by a Catholic priest, although in fact Abby had converted to the Catholic Church on the previous day. John Shanahan was a farmer in Glenahilty near Ballynocane. His father was Matthew Shanahan, and Griffith's valuation in 1850 shows Matthew Shanahan as a farmer with 10 acres in Glenahilty. But John and Mary moved around over the next period, which suggests that John was not even farming the 10 acres before his father died. Their children were baptized in Borrisokane, and Abby died in New Lawn in the parish of Terryclass. Major Stoney doesn't leave out the Roman Catholic children of Dr. James Johnson Stoney of the Aran Islands, so I suspect the marriage to a small farmer, maybe a landless man, was more of an embarrassment to him. Another brother of the Major and Abigail was the Reverend George Stoney. He seems to have taken leave from his job as rector of Ballyjamesduff to take a job as curate of Castletown Beer. Tin mines had been opened at Allihies, and some mining technicians from Cornwall, who were members of the Church of England, were working there. A strike developed, and the Reverend George took a sympathetic attitude. The rector sacked him. He said it was because George had used intemperate language to him, but everyone else said it was because he had supported the strike. The rector's daughter was married to the mine's owner, who was also the local landlord. After his dismissal, Mr. Hallahan, the rector, and the Reverend George carried on arguments in the newspapers, such as this one, where he says, it is a disgrace to an Irish landlord to be an absentee. His duty is to reside on his property, to spend his income amongst the shopkeepers, tradesmen, and labourers in the locality. It is a greater disgrace when resident to pauperize the country by not granting lengthy leases to his tenantry and by exacting meadow rent for Heathy Mountain. As for Mr. Puxley, that's the landlord and mine owner, as for Mr. Puxley spending hundreds amongst his tenants and labourers, he may very well do so when they earn thousands for him. The baker who supplies our breakfast bread need not give us much credit for purchasing from him in preference to enduring starvation. George died of pneumonia later that year in August, after having returned to Ballyjamesduff and having been caught in a shower while answering a pastoral call outside his parish boundary. Another brother of these was Thomas Sadleir Stoney, a barrister who married Eleanor Luby, a cousin of the Fenian Thomas Clark Luby. In 1862, there was a meeting of the Irish Volunteer Association in Dublin, where there was a proposal to form a volunteer corps. According to a newspaper report, we seem to have a problem moving this on. Here we are. Mr. Sadleir Stoney proposed a resolution to the effect that it is the right of Irishmen to be permitted to form rifle volunteer corps in their own country. He said they came there that evening to do what they did in 1782, when they were prepared to stand shoulder to shoulder in array for the rights of old Ireland. He asked them, was not the same blood in their veins as in those of their forefathers, who at the time they declared their independence declared that no power on earth had a right to rule Ireland but the King, Lords and Commons of Ireland. Mr. Stoney said that what they wanted to explain to the English government was that in no part of the Queen's dominions was there such loyalty felt towards the Queen as in Ireland. So the House of Commons was deprived of an orator. A few years later, he was talked of as a candidate for Tipperary, but was criticised for the vagueness of his manifesto. He in the end supported a Liberal candidate, saying that he himself was not a Liberal, Whig, Tory, Radical, or Conservative. So perhaps he was a bit vague. Although a magistrate and a barrister, Sadlier was sentenced to 3 months for assault in 1892, a case which even reached the Pall Mall Gazette in London. Mr. Sadlier Stoney, a justice of the peace and barrister at law, was charged with an assault on Mrs. Bunbury. It was stated that while Mrs. Bunbury went out to visit a lady friend in the neighbourhood who was about to leave for the continent, Captain Bunbury, who was drinking, invited Mr. Sadlier Stoney, it's printed a story, who resides in the vicinity, to join him, and that when she returned, the two gentlemen were engaged carousing in a room to which she was refused admittance. The door was locked, and with a small hatchet she attempted to break it open, whereupon Mr. Sadlier Stoney, rushing out, felled her with a blow, and seizing the hatchet, beat her with it. He aimed a blow at the edge of the hatchet at her. The coachman came up, but Mr. Sadlier Stoney, hatchet in hand, chased both of them, and afterwards, when Mrs. Bunbury, fearing for the safety of her children, ran to the nursery, she found the infuriated gentleman pursuing the nurse round a table and proclaiming his intention to murder her if only he could lay hands on her. Mr. Sadlier Stoney defended himself and contended that the assault was a slight one and much exaggerated. This Captain Bunbury was a great-grandson of Elizabeth Smith, the daughter of George Stoney, and therefore a distant cousin of Sadlier's. The final ones of the, we left out, this is another brother, the Reverend Ralph Stoney, who married Sibylla Frances Homan. His father, the Reverend William Travers Homan, was rector of Modrini, which is the next parish to Boris O'Kane. The Homans were Cromwellian settlers in Westmeath. The final ones of the 5 inheriting sons of Thomas Stoney was James Johnson Stoney, not to be confused with either of the ones we've met before. In 1841, he was spoken of as a possible Liberal candidate for Kings County. He married Elizabeth Lucia Minchin, the daughter of the Reverend William Minchin of Greenhills near Moneygall, who went bankrupt. And because his tenants had to be listed in the bankruptcy proceedings, we know that one of them was Joseph Carney, the ancestor of Barack Obama. The Minchins were Cromwellian settlers. So, while the Stoney estates were built up in the 18th century, the 19th century is one of decline. Mortgages, obligations to women in marriage settlements, probably failure to adjust lifestyles to income, and perhaps, as the great George Stoney had feared, they just were not hard workers, and dividing the lands into 5 hardly helped. By the 1901 census, there are only 6 Stoneys in Tipperary, 3 elderly unmarried women, a visitor from the Kilcormac family, and at Ballyknockain, Thomas Johnson Stoney, son of Sadlier Stoney, and his wife. Of course, Portland was still in family possession, but the Butler Stoneys were all army officers and therefore absent on census day. In Offaly, there were 5 descendants of Robert Johnson Stoney, 5 from the Emil Castle family, 1 from Kilcormac, and 6 who can't be placed on the family tree. The estates were on the way out. And that's it.